In 1987, Test Drive came out. I was 12 years old and it might have only had 4 colors CGA graphics, but I felt like I was driving a car. Grand Prix Circuit came the following year, EGA graphics with 16 colors, 8 tracks, multiple Formula 1 cars, and now I was in pole position. I couldn't believe how they could make games this good. I even made it to the top of the podium. Outrun, I was in that one for the music. Some 3D games started to come too, like Stunt Car Racers, even had physics and suspension, and keep that in mind for the rest of this video because we're going to be talking about that. Test Drive 2 was probably the benchmark of all racers back then. It was epic. I really enjoyed driving that one with my friends, and it felt like I was driving down the streets and racing for real. Then a new era of 3D games started to come. Vette had some 3D cars, but it left quite a lot to be desired in terms of the driving experience inside of it, but it was cool that it was coming. We had top-down racers like Iron Man Off-Road Racing, where you could do local multiplayer. And then we have Stunts, probably the best 3D game of its time, and I had a lot of fun. We were jumping jumps, you could take big corners, I think you could even do loops, and it had a replay system, which is even tough to do today. Test Drive 3, it was trying to push the 3D, but it didn't do as good of a job as Stunts, so I wasn't too impressed by that one, and I actually preferred to play the previous version of Test Drive 2 instead of Test Drive 3, but I think they were really trying to, they knew what their future was holding in terms of racing games, so 3D it was. Maybe Turbo Outrun was one of the last few ones that were using the old 2D style. 2D stuck around a little bit though, because we have top-down racers like Carnage, where you head around in these little tiny cars, and then my favorite, Slicks and Slide. 1994 and the Need for Speed came out. It blew my mind. You could do donuts, there were skid marks, there was tire smoke, and you could race down the Alpine course with your friend. And this actually set the bar for the future for me. I really wanted to create some form of racing game sometime. And now I'm loading up Unreal Engine, and we're going to be talking a little bit about creating some arcade physics, and here's my prototype so far. guys, and welcome to another video. I hope you enjoyed that little flashback into the gaming in the 1980s. Well, it was the late 80s. I think Test Drive 2 came out in 1987, and then it was a couple of years there with quick succession. They were ramping up the game, going from CGA 4 colors to EGA 16 colors and VGA with 256 colors. So in our world, it was a big mind blown as that progression was going so fast in our mind. But we had CRT monitors back then too, so it didn't look quite as bad as if you look at the pixel art today, it looks like super blocky, especially on our big monitors. But we had smaller screens and the CRT lines blurred it, and I tried to simulate that a little bit in the intro so you could see what it felt like. But in the early days, everything was 2D, and you tried to simulate 3D driving by having like a tilted road and then just some sprites moving sideways. That's how Test Drive 1 and 2 did it. And also Outrun, that was a fun game. So a few of those, and Grand Prix Circuit, that was underrated. That was amazing, actually. You could race around 8 real-life tracks with Formula 1 cars, and that was... when I tried it again recently, though, I realized you don't really have to turn that much to go around the circuit. It looks like you got to turn, but you don't really. But never mind. After 2D, 3D came along, and there was, I mean, I guess it was the big game changer. All the games had to go 3D, but they weren't quite powerful enough. The computers didn't have enough power just yet. So Test Drive 3 was a big disappointment. I remember us playing Test Drive 2 instead. Even though it was 3D in Test Drive 3, it was like, no. We'll like the old scale, the old school stuff. It looked, but then Vette came, and that also had 3D. The cars looked kind of cool, but the driving experience, not so much. But then we had a couple of game changers. Stunt Car Racer, that came along, and it actually has pretty decent physics. And keep that in mind for the rest of this video, because they're actually calculating the suspension, and they projected like your car onto a racetrack, and you were doing some jumping and nice turn with like a tilted corners, whatever that's called. So, and then after that we had the stunts, which was amazing too. I played that one a lot with my friends, and it was also pretty decent. You had 3D, you had cool jumps that you could jump, and big ramps and bridges and turns and loops and all sorts of stuff. And I remember having a lot of fun in that game. So that was a big game changer. But the biggest game changer of all game changers was when the Need for Speed came out. That was absolutely amazing, mind blown. I mean, we came from stuff that looked not even a tenth as good, and then in just like a couple of years, something like that came. You could do donuts, it had skid marks, it had smoke, it had cool sounds, alpine, long, windy road. You could race around with your friends. You could even link it up and play against each other, I think. Could you do that? You could do that in the second Need for Speed anyway. And oh yeah, you could do it in the first one too. We had a null modem cable and linked that up and raced. I always liked the Testarossa, and my friends usually drive the Diablo. But that was just such a cool game, and it really sparked my idea now, because I've been dabbing a little bit with racing for, like, I don't know, the past 20 years. I did like a Performa Cars, it was called. It's a top-down little racing game, and I was inspired by those slicks and slide type of games and supercars on the Amiga. I love those games. And I really wanted to make something similar, so in Blitzmax I created this little top-down racer with 8 cars, and I had pretty big ambitions, and I'm happy with the graphics. I mean, this is only a few years after those early games. So when I look back at it now, like 3-4 years after those came out, I think it was the late 90s that I managed to do that. And I was pretty happy with it, but again, it was a bit overscoped at the end, because I wanted to add multiplayer, and I struggled with that one, because I hadn't architected the code at all for multiplayer. It was such a struggle, so I had stuff that was bound into like the frame rate of the monitor, and it was just a mess, but it was a lot of fun. I released that freeware in the end, and I think it's still available on my itch page, so you can do some championship racing there. I also did a little quick series a few years ago now. Time's passing fast, but it was the low poly racing series, where I created a little racetrack and had a low poly car, and you could drive around and skid. And for that one I was using the Unity wheel collider, and I was really not happy with the result I could get. I could get it to speed up and drive around, but I could not control the slip and the skidding of the car, and especially trying to get those nice drifts around the corner. So now we're here, it's 2025, and I was dusting off this Nissan R35 model that I did a couple of years ago again. I got a tutorial video in my channel history if you want to see how to model that one. So I got that one for my PixPal palette texture, brought it in, and I thought, this is it. I'm learning Unreal Engine and I'm gonna bring this car into Unreal Engine and have a little play now. Can I get this thing to race around? And I was initially gonna do top-down racing, but then for some reason, as you saw in the intro, I'm like, I fell for it. So I brought the camera down into the Need for Speed type of camera angle behind the car, but I actually preferred to drive inside the cars. Because it was simulators to me, so you had to be in the car, you wouldn't be flying behind it. But now I'm at the point where I'm actually got a little spring arm camera behind the car, and it feels good, especially when you're drifting, because you can get a feel for it, and you can see how much the car is drifting. And that brings us onto the topic of this video, which is the car physics. And initially I was testing out the Havoc engine in Unreal Engine, a lot of engines here, and it's got some stuff for cars, and it comes with an off-road car and a built-in race car. And I was trying that, and I mean, it's cool suspension, it looks great, and don't get me wrong, it's a really capable thing, but I could not get the thing to drift. I could not get that skidding going. So I decided to have a look around on the internet, and I found a video that explained the forces that apply to a car, and it was explaining it really, really well. It explained the suspension, it explained the acceleration, and also the tire friction. And it did it in such a way, and it showed the formula so I can finally understand. Basically, you do line tracing in Unreal Engine or raycasts in Unity, and you shoot rays down from the wheels or where the suspension is. And when that hits the ground, you can use a pretty simple formula to calculate the spring force that's required to push the car back up. And it was a bit of a magic moment, because I tried to replicate that now inside Unreal Engine in a blueprint. And it turns out that only a few lines of C# code turns into a big heap of mess when it looks in a blueprint. There's so many nodes, so even just a multiplication sign or a minus sign or a plus sign, everything like that just becomes a new node, and it adds to the spaghetti more and more and more. So it was a bit of a challenge, but it was a perfect learning opportunity, because then I could start to arrange my blueprint, and I started to get a feel for how to organize the nodes. I could block select a few of them, press Q to align them, and then I could press C when I had a bunch of them selected to frame them and name them a little bit. And gradually I learned a little bit on how to create functions, so I could break out some of the suspension functionality into a separate blueprint, or a separate function within the blueprint. I learned how to expose variables and have them firing off from the blueprint into the function, and then returning values. And slowly but surely I managed to get my blueprint in place. So I did the suspension first, and to my surprise it worked really well. I had just a physics box inside the car chassis. I lifted it up, and after I'd done my blueprint, I just dropped it in the engine, and it just worked. It acted as a suspension. My mind was blown. So that brought me on to the next part, and I was adding acceleration then. So I could do the same thing. I looked at the formulas in the Unity, or in the video that I found for Unity, and then I replicated that inside a blueprint to add the forward motion of the car. And after that, I looked at the one that added sideways friction to the tires. And those are pretty much all the three that you need to get the car to drive around. So I managed to implement all of those three into separate functions within my blueprint. So I had first I had the suspension, and then I had the forward acceleration motion, and then I had the sideways friction. I was super happy with that, until I realized that I cannot get the car to skid again. No matter how I tweaked the sideways friction variables, no matter what I did, I either had too much grip and it just let go, or it was just too loose to begin with, and I could not really get that to feel right. And as I started to think about it, it sort of makes sense, because I want to have a car racing game where you race with a keyboard. So you press up, or I guess W to accelerate, and then you have two keys, A and D, and they're digital to steer left and right. And when you look at how real cars, like if you wanted to drift a car, for example, how would that work? Well, first of all, you have a steering wheel, and that one's analog, so you can turn it as much as you want, left and right, and as quickly as you want. The second thing is that a car auto steers, so when you're actually in a skid, if you let go of the wheel, it just automatically rotates back to point in the velocity of the car. And then you have the tire friction. So first of all, you've got a lot of grip with tires, but then when you get to a certain point, you lose friction and you start to slide, and then you actually have to have less force to maintain that friction. So that's tire modeling. And as I started to add these things up, okay, digital input, and we had the auto steering correction thing, based on the velocity, and we had the different friction slip curves. And I was thinking, okay, I'm trying to get a simple arcade game. I'm not going to be able to do it. It's not going to be possible. I would have to have too many helper functions to try to correct all these things. It'll be like an F-117 stealth fighter that's not really designed to fly or something. So it was just, okay, that was pretty much out the window. So I thought, what are my options then? And then I thought, okay, I'm happy with the suspension and I'm happy with the acceleration, but I'm not happy with the wheel friction. So then I thought, okay, what if I apply torque just? So I'll scrap the wheel friction. So I'll just apply torque left or right, depending if I turn. And then I'll use an animation curve or a float curve to decide at what speed I'm driving. I'll use whatever speed I'm driving to control how much force is applied. So I was cheating. It's pure cheating. So if I'm going slow, it's not applying any torque, but if I'm going faster, it's applying more torque. So then I just controlled the turning force with that curve. And after that curve, I also had to take into account the angular velocity of the car. So there's drag when something rotates, and I think the default value is 0.05 or something. So basically, if you put a spin on something, it'll keep spinning. So I had to ramp up the angular drag so it would basically stabilize after you turn the car. And at different speeds, I had to apply different amount of drag. And in the air, I just have to bring it back to the default drag. So if you jump in the air, it needs to behave like a normal car again, or like a normal object that's flying through air. But I also created a curve in the end that controls the drag. So based on how fast I'm going and how much I'm steering and what sort of wheel spin I think I've got, I'll just control the angular drag and have that. So it's not perfect yet, but I'm happy at the state where it is, because now I'm able to drive around the track and I can steer it with my digital keys left and right, and I can control it with my throttle, and it starts to feel right. Like I can get into a really nice slide and I can control it. It's sensitive, and it'll take some getting used to. When you try this first, you're probably gonna skid off the track and get super angry and thinking this sucks. You know, the controls are bad. But again, if you put yourself in a real car and try to drift around, I guess it'll take you a few goes, or like at least a few tries, or even a few hours to get that thing to drift. And it's the same with this physics that I've created now. I'm at the point now where I can have a lot of fun. It's delicate, it's intricate, but it makes a real challenge. And when I started to get fed up a little bit with the default track, I brought this in and I created my own track. So I'm using the spline system and the terrain system in Unreal Engine, super cool stuff. And I was using that to create a little new racetrack, and I realized I cannot make it like a normal racetrack. I need to have pretty tight turns because it's an arcadey game and I wanted the drift, and I cannot have super steep and weird slopes. But I can create a pretty cool track, and I set it into the landscape, and then I added my material that I did for another YouTube video, and it simulates a little bit like a Fortnite style material, and it needs to work in the future still, but at least it's got grass, it's got some mud, it's got sand, and it's got some pebbles. So I just added a few of those things to my racetrack around it, and it set it into the landscape. I also had some low poly trees that I brought in from before, and I did a windmill for Unfair Rampage, so I brought that one in just to have a few different things, and one of the bridges from in there. Just needed a few assets to have it land a little bit in the landscape. And suddenly I was racing around this track and I had a lot of fun. I was like, I don't have any lap timer yet, but I wanted to hit the perfect line and get all those slides. And if you mess up, then basically you'll lose a few seconds because the car will stop and go to the side and you need to correct and turn. Plus I don't have reversing yet, so and if you flip the car, it's got zero friction. And it's flat like a pancake. So I've got clearly a few more things to do. But overall, I'm really happy with this thing. I mean, I'm having a good time racing this thing. Then I thought I needed to add a few more things because I had the car going around, but I wanted skid marks. So I actually added that a little bit earlier. But my skid marks, sounds weird. My skid marks are just Niagara. That's even worse. It's not Niagara skid marks. It's the particle system in Unreal Engine, and I'm just plotting out a whole bunch of little quads at a really high rate, like 400 a second or something. So I think, and I keep the trail for 240 seconds. So I think it's like nearly 100,000 particles, but it seems to be coping fine. It's just like spamming out those particles and placing them on the ground as a trail. I just detect how much wheel skid I've got, and then I add just an alpha value to my particle system, and it just plots them out. And I just want them on the rear tires because it's more like a power drift. I could add it to the front tires too, but I always feel weird, like when you do a power slide, you don't really want skid marks from the front tires. That looks a bit stupid in my mind. And I also did the same with the smoke. I just Brought in some quads because it's like low poly style, so I might change that in like for a sprite later on. But I decided to do some smoke, so in the same way I just copied pretty much the first particle system, Niagara system, and then I did the smoke trail, so bigger particles, white, that was slowly raising up and had a little bit of turbulence and rotation on them. And I was happy with that, and then I realized that Unreal Engine has got the same problem like Unity, and it has the same problem like any game engine, and that is alpha sorting. It's a huge problem on computers and on GPUs. If you have something that's transparent, it doesn't really know how to sort it properly. So sometimes I had the smoke being in front of the tire marks, and sometimes the tire marks were in front of the smoke, and it can create this flicker effect. And you just have to work around it. You have to find ways. And finally, in the end, I found a way to get it to sort. It had some options in the settings to sort, but it didn't work. But I ended up doing that. The skid marks are rendering before depth of field, and then my smoke is rendering after depth of field. And since I wasn't using depth of field at the moment, it works, because then it renders all the skid marks first, and then it puts on my smoke. So that worked pretty good, until I'm gonna probably enable depth of field, so I'm gonna be biting the bullet and trying to figure out how to solve that one. I know how to solve it in Unity, because you got render queues, you can control and force the order of things, but I haven't found the equivalent just yet in Unreal Engine, so that's a little topic to learn. After the skid and the smoke, I also wanted, what was the next thing? It was the little backfire flames. So sometimes when, especially in tuned cars, in race cars, you have a little flame coming out of the exhaust, because basically, if you want to get into the details, I don't know the physics or anything, but sometimes you'll just have like extra fuel getting injected, even if it doesn't need it, just to keep things like turbos and stuff going and having the flow. And some of that stuff gets into the exhaust and just ignites, and that creates these little loud bangs and poofs. So I decided to create a Niagara, and these are just like little default circle particles. I was going to draw like a little flame first, but then I thought, no, I'm just going to use the default particles. So I spawned them. They only live for like 0.1 seconds, and then I had a bit of a range between yellow and red, and then I applied a little bit of upwards force, and the trick was just to keep them really super short so they're snappy, and they're simulating in local space. If I simulated in world space, they just like puffed behind the car. I needed to actually attach them to the car, so they're simulated with Niagara in local space relative to the car. I created a material for it and added a lot of emission to get them to bloom up, so it looks pretty much like fire. I'm happy with it, even if I haven't drawn the flames. All right, and then we come to sound, and then that was another topic to learn things in Unreal Engine. Perfect opportunity to learn these things. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna have a few, because I know generally how you do it. You have car sounds, and then you have loops at different RPM. So you got one at idle, you got one at like 2000 RPM, 3000, 4000, 5000, 6000, and all the way up. And then you crossfade between those. So you crossfade from the idle up to the next set of the RPM as you accelerate. And you also have to do some pitch shifting, because otherwise it just sounds like like an organ or something. So you need to pitch shift in there. And I started to learn a little bit about meta sounds in Unreal Engine. Super powerful, cool stuff you can do. It's like blueprints, but it's not the same, I learned. It looks like a blueprint, but it works differently. You have to think a little bit differently. But I sort of got it to work after I had to even create a little sketch and calculate and create an algorithm, and it actually took me like 4 or 5 hours to get this thing in place, because I had to have it so that it detects which one to play, and then I had 2 channels, and it decided to pick the A or the B channel and then play that sample on loop and then pitch shift it a little bit and bring it up. And I was really happy at the end. I thought, I've nailed it now. I've managed to solve the thing. I had to actually do a Python script first and code the thing and run some tests locally, because I could not, like my iteration speed was way too slow in the blueprint. So maybe that's a little bit of a tip. If you're trying to solve something mathematically or whatever, for me, it was much better to just do it in a Python script so I could print the output and scan with my eyes and see, because it would have taken me like 10s or 20s hours to try to get that thing right. And it was just such a mind bender of an algorithm. I'm not really good with maths, so it was like, a struggle. I had to really focus, block everything out and just did it. Turns out in the end that it sounded horrible. It was useless. It was crappy. It was like beyond the worst. Like the crossfading didn't work, the pitch shifting didn't work, and it sounded like, I don't know, like a broken flute that a kid was playing. I don't know, I can't even describe how bad it was, and I was so disappointed. But I'm not really, like, failure is learning, so I learned, okay, I'm not going to be able to do it that way, but I learned a lot of stuff about meta sounds in the process, and I know how not to do it. So I was okay with that. And then I found that the old way of doing it in Unreal Engine was using sound cues, and it had a node that basically crossfades to different loops on different, like on a float value from 0 to 1. So that was a lot easier. I did that, and it sort of worked, but it sounded bad still because you didn't have the pitch shifting, and I didn't really want to use the old way of doing it with sound cues either. I want meta sounds to work. So in the end, I was unhappy with both of those, and no matter how I did it, I tried to simulate the RPM, because I don't know the RPM of the car. It doesn't have any concept of gear and gear ratios. So as I was doing it, it just sounded like, I don't know, it was pitching up and pitching down, and it wasn't doing a very good job at sounding great either. So in the end, I had to think, well, what did I learn from the physics? Well, if I used real physics, it didn't really work the way I wanted to. I couldn't get the sliding and the driving the way I wanted to. But if I faked part of it to focus on how I wanted it to feel, then I could have got it to work. So I thought, I'm going to do the same with audio now. And what I was doing, like basically, you don't care about shifting in this game. It's basically just like driving forward, skidding and braking, and then going back and forth, like forward, 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 power sliding. So I just want something to sound pretty cool and that is close enough to what the car is doing. And I just don't want this pitching up and down. I need some gear shifting in there. So I found this really cool simulator tool online, and I was blown away. Someone's actually taken the time to think about how the combustion and cylinders and crankshafts and everything, the vents, I don't know, everything, they've thought about it, and then I've simulated it and modeled it so you can simulate the sound of a car engine, and then you can put the data in for a particular car, like in this case the Nissan R35, and if you put in the timings, the number of cylinders, the cubic inches of things, and just how the whole thing is designed, and that takes a bit of time to do. So I found someone that's actually done that too, which is kind of cool. Don't know if it's accurate, but people just upload these things, so I'm going to make sure that I can get, like, if the license, I don't think there's any licensing, because when you upload the thing, it's just like, here, I've created the car sound for this. It's got zero mentions about anything, so I guess I can, I'll have to look into it. Worst case, I'll just have to like model the car system, because all the data is there. I mean, all the sizes of the cylinders and the exhausts and everything. It's actually simulating the exhaust too and making a crazy sound. So I ended up just loading up this cool simulator tool, and then it's got loads of key bindings. So you can accelerate, you can gear shift, you can do clutch, you can do, and it simulates rolling friction. It simulates like with like you're on a dyno machine. So I ended up being able to create really cool acceleration ramps and deceleration ramps, because a car engine sounds different. If it's accelerating, and it's called on load, so it's got a different sound to it than if you just release the gas, then it's off load. So it's pretty important to have like the distinction between those two. And doing it this way, I could just create ramps, and I ramped up, and then I did a few of those, and then I ramped down a few of those, and I had the idle sound, and I also did when it's hitting the rev limiter and the top speed, I created some sound loops for those too. And then what I ended up doing to implement it is I created a meta sound that basically, a lot of basically stuff here, it just looks at if I'm accelerating, it's looking if I'm decelerating, or letting go of all the controls. And then it crossfades between these sounds, and it picks a random sound. So if I'm doing nothing, it's just playing the idle sound. But if I'm pressing the acceleration key and it detects that I'm accelerating, then it actually crossfades to the acceleration sound, and then it, let's see, it interpolates to the acceleration sound, and it picks one by random. And then it just plays that one, and then if I keep holding it, then it just transitions and fades onto a top speed loop too, if you actually made it to the top. And if you release it, it detects that I'm decelerating, so it crossfades in the meta sound over to my deceleration loop. First it picks a random one out of those as well, because I've got like 3 or 4 different ones. And then it decelerates down all the way to 0, and when you've done that, it just goes back into idle. And finally, I also have the last crossfade possibility, is that if I got a lot of wheel friction and I'm pressing my throttle, then it's basically wants to hit the rev limiter. So then I crossfade to the loop of the rev limiter sound. And this is working pretty good. If you race around and just having a good time, you're like throttling up and down, and you're racing and you're skidding, it sounds, in my opinion, it sounds better than if I would have done it the RPM way to simulate the RPMs. It just gets a much more arcadey, like aggressive type of sound, and stuff is happening. The downside, I guess, is that if you wanted to try to use it as a simulator, then introduce manual gear shifting, it's not going to work, because it's just basically picking a random start place. It just makes it sound like you're going through the gears up and down. So if you start to analyze it and you like roll a little bit and you press the throttle, you'll realize that it's not really that perfect. But for this type of game, I want fast-paced racing. You're going to be drifting. It's going to be like a time trial thing. You don't really want to be spending time doing that. So make it good sound. It's all smoke and mirrors. Same with the physics. So both the physics and the sound, it's like simulate something that feels and looks good and sounds good. And if it does that, I'm halfway there. So it's not a simulator. I'm not intending to build a simulator. If someone complains and says this is not like how a real car works, that's fine, because it's not like one of those games. There are loads of cool games like Assetto Corsa or Live for Speed and stuff. Super good simulation there. This is just pure good old arcade fun. So the particles I mentioned before about doing those little backflame things, those are also Niagara system. And I realized that you can tie sounds to that. So Niagara is actually playing a little a puff sound, or like a little bang when that you get that little combustion thing, and then I realized that Universal Sound Effects doesn't actually have any sounds that were good. It has some explosion and flak cannon stuff, but nothing that was higher pitched to get those little bangs. So I created a bunch of those that I'll be putting into Universal Sound Effects too, because I just needed to have those little exhaust bangs. So it randomizes a little bit. So sometimes there's no puffs at all, and sometimes a few of them come out, and then sometimes it does between 1, 2, and 3. And I could create all of that. It's just logic within Niagara to say like, play it and randomize it a little bit, play these sounds when you do it, and alternate the volume. And I was super happy with the result. And I also tied so that they only do it like when you release the throttle. So if you're coming into a curve to do a power slide, and then you release the throttle, and then you might throw a few of those pops up, and then you accelerate. So it feels it's not like real life, but it feels good. I'm super happy. It adds a lot to the feeling of it. And then I also did skid sounds. I actually did that a little bit earlier, but I got a whole bunch of skid sounds now in Universal Sound Effects, and they're in the current release on my website. So I just brought one of them in. I've got like 20 of them in the sound pack, I think, but I just got one of them in, and then I looked at the variables that I have for creating the skid marks, and I just used that to crossfade the volume of that loop. Okay, what else? I haven't mentioned the rolling of the wheel, and that's also simulated. It's basically, the blueprint is basically, again, the blueprint is looking for each wheel. It's looking how much has traveled since the last frame, and then just rotate the wheels to accommodate for that distance. So that was, it works pretty good, but what you'll probably realize that if you're doing a power slide, you'd really want to rotate the back wheels faster. And so I haven't simulated that yet, but you cannot really tell. So I'll probably throw that in at a later time. I also put some taillights on, and I've already got the emission on the front and the head taillights from before, but then I added just some lights. So when you hit the brake pedal, it just lights up 2 lights there to make it like exaggerated and shine a little bit nicely. I think the lighting is super cool in Unreal Engine. Really impressed with the way everything looks. The reflections and lighting's superb, I think. And it's time to have a look a little bit more closer at the blueprint, I suppose, for this car. And it probably looks absolutely like daunting and terrifying. As I scroll through here, you can see that there's so many nodes. And the stuff like this terrified me in the beginning. And I thought, how can you make a game and have so many nodes? You won't really know. Like, I'm so used to having little C# files everywhere, like a little code for this, a little code for simulating such and such, a little camera script, a little suspension script, or a little impact sound script. And my mind was just so focused on that's the way it works. So I thought as soon as I'd get into something like this, it would be absolutely ludicrous and crazy. But now when I've done it for like a few days, up to a week of solid, like all the nights, 5 hours every night when I should have been sleeping, because I'm doing my indie course during the daytime, so that's cool. But as I was going through this, I started to feel like I knew where things were in the blueprint. So as I iterated and did over and over again, and then I started using the commenting system and I tidied up my nodes, it's pretty easy now to come into this for me and go like, okay, suspension, it's this one. So, and then I've got a whole bunch of variables. I mean, it could be, I think they could organize a little bit better, because this, it's insane. In a blueprint, you cannot sort these things. Like this, you'll have like a bunch of wheel position up here, and it's like a W thing, and then you've got the spring arm, and then another wheel position. Why can you not sort this thing? like, you cannot drag and sort it, you cannot alphabetically sort it. So you can't even use a naming scheme to do it. So come on, Unreal Engine or Epic, fix that, please. Because you can sort the variables down here, but not this order. So I guess people just accept it and live with it. But you can sort these, and I've got a whole bunch of variables. They've grown over time, and it took me a while to get used to, but as I started to define them, they plop up here. You have global variables, and then you have a bunch of local variables within functions too, which I found was useful. So I mean, I cannot go through this in detail, but I can give you a little flyover, so at least you can slow down the video and pause if you want to see a few things. It catches your interest. But there's an event called Begin Play, and I've learned to use these little sequence are pretty nice to use, little sequence nodes, because otherwise you'd end up with everything on a really, really long string like this to the end, and that one happens to be super long too. But these sequences you can do, like, because it'll complete this one first, and then it'll move to the next one, and I do that down here too. So first it does 0, then 1, then 2, then 3. So you can pick the order here. And in event begin play, I do input mapping, because I'm using, apparently Unreal Engine also has the equivalent of the new input system, like Unity does too, but this is the enhanced input system. Took me some Googling and stuff to understand it, but it seems like to be a robust system, and I'm happy with it. So I just followed some tutorials how to add the mapping context and create my little input action things. And then I created a few input actions that I can map to, so the steering is triggered by this input action underscore car steer. And you've got accelerate key, and I've got like a brake key too. And these basically just set these variables. I won't have time to go through these. It's just worth mentioning, I guess. Then after I've done the input mapping, I do, apparently another thing is you cannot pass a variable down to a child blueprint just by dragging the blueprint in. Because I tried this first. I just grabbed the BPA car skids, and then I thought, okay, perfect, I'm going to pass variables into here. But it doesn't work like that. And I was like scratching my head a little bit first. But apparently you have to cast it to a child actor and then cast it back to this blueprint and then set it up. So I ended up having to do that. I don't know why you have to do that, but I guess it makes sense to someone. So this is just to be able to allow me to pass variables later on. And I just wanted to go a little bit, I guess, through a little flyover here. So in the event tick, that's every frame. One thing that I learned pretty useful is you can set the tick group, and you can set it to post physics. I did because I wanted physics to take its course first, and then I'll apply some new forces and stuff for the next frame. So it's a bit like fixed update equivalent in Unity. If you come from there, you can control if it's going to do a pre-physics or post-physics, and it doesn't have a concept of fixed time like Unity does, or fixed update and update. So this is a little bit of adaptation to get used to and learn how these things work. This one, the first one, is just calculating a bunch of variables. Actually, this is a function. So I broke this out. So in this function, the first thing it does is calculate car speed as a dot product of car forward vector and car velocity vector. So I'm just getting the physics of my only physics object, which is this primitive box. So I'm getting the linear velocity of that one, and just calculating and setting the variable, and getting the forward vector. And then I do protect against 0 vector error, because I had a problem where, like, if I was standing still, it didn't know what to do. And then I calculated a normalized speed. So that's a value between 0 to 1. So if I'm standing at a stop, it's going to be 0. If I'm at my max speed, it's at 1. So it's just taking my current speed and dividing it by top speed. So what I started to like a little bit, especially when you organize the nodes like tidy like this, then I'm pretty happy with seeing these things instead of having them as a C#. Even if it's like taking up a lot of space, real estate on the screen, I'm actually really happy with the fact that I can get this overview, because I can look at it and go, okay. This was not my initial reaction, by the way. As I started, I'm like, this is ridiculous. I gotta do so many things just to create little simple arithmetic stuff. But now when I'm looking at it, okay, if I want to tweak something, I could, if I want to create an alternative version of how I do this, I could copy this whole thing. So if I wanted to create an alternative version of this one, I could like put different values in to do something, and then I could just reroute like this and try it with this one. And then if I wasn't happy with it, I could just delete it. So I found this to be a pretty good flow, and especially when it starts to get a little bit organized like this, I could create alternative versions. So that just calculates a few variables. All right. Back in the event graph, I reset the steering. So if I'm not steering anymore, I switch the target velocity or target steering value. That's not so much to talk through. I guess the more important thing to talk about is, and this is what comes from, and this is actually where I started. My blueprint started with this, only this suspension thing. And this is where I was looking at that car physics video that was excellently explaining the actual things, the mathematics behind it. I also found out later on that it's not the full truth. But it's a pretty good approximation to get something moving a little bit like a car suspension. This one actually hides, this wheel suspension does not exist. It's not a node that exists in Unreal Engine. So this is a function that I've created, because first I had it in my blueprint, and then you can box select a few things, right click, and you can collapse this to a function. So to tidy it up later, because I needed to do it per wheel, I ended up doing it. But I'm feeding in where the wheel position is, what the wheel mesh is, and I'm the front rest distance. So this is the spring distance that I've got a variable to set just how long the spring should be. The front spring strength, that's another value, variable. So how strong the spring should be, and then the damper value is how much the dampening should be. Found really good stuff in that video, explains the damping and the spring force really good. I ride motocross too, so I should really know how like suspension works, but I don't, and that's probably why I crash a little bit more than I should, because every time I tweak the suspension I crash because I don't know what I'm doing, I guess. So that feeds into this wheel suspension, and this is a one that goes through, basically I set this one, I find this a little bit tedious because I set a bunch of local variables, and I'm wondering if there's a quicker way to do these things, because I could drag all the nodes from here into where they're going, but then it doesn't become tidy, so I decided to create some of the variables that I need. So I just basically bring out the rest distance, the spring length, strength, the damper, wheel position, and the spring direction and wheel mesh, bring that out and set them into some variables. So I got here. And then I do the line trace, so suspension line trace. It takes from the wheel position, it shoots, and makes it pretty good, so you can see. I'm not expecting you to understand, or I mean, this has taken me a long time to build. So I'm not trying to teach you how to do this. I just want to explain a little bit. Maybe you can pick up a few like hints or aha or gotchas or something from this. So if you're interested, let's just go through a few of these. I can explain what's happening. So the suspension for the wheel is all based on this line trace. Starting position is the wheel position, which is actually up by where it's mounted onto the body. And then I look at the rest distance, and then I multiply that by -1 because I want it to go down. And then I look at the spring direction, and then I add those together. And then this is my end of the line trace. So it's got the start, and then it's shooting it basically straight down because the spring directions are down. And then it's profile block all. It just does a trace, a complex trace, not sure about stuff, ignores itself, so I don't hit with myself. So if that line trace hits the ground, then the wheel is grounded. So is wheel grounded? If it is, I'll set that one local, and this is just, I put L before so I can know that it's local, and it sets that it's true or false. And if it's false, so if it's not grounded, I can skip all the suspension calculation, and I just like, if the line trace is not hitting the ground, I'm just sent all the way to here, and this is just to set the wheel mesh location when I'm airborne. It needs to actually, because first they got stuck where they were before if I didn't do anything. So I just need to figure out like what's the max, what's the position when the wheel is out at the max position of the spring. So just, I can't remember if I lerp it there or I just snap it back, I think. It works pretty good. So that's if I'm airborne, but if I'm not airborne, then like I'm grounded, so true, I go down in here. So then I take the line trace result, and I got a whole bunch of things here, but I'm mainly looking at the distance of the line trace and the impact point. And then I use this stuff, and this is just calculating based on like that impact, the dot vector and stuff. I keep forgetting what these things do, dot and cross products. I always have to look it up because my math is not where it should be. Here is where I copied the arithmetic, if that's even the right word to use, the mathematic, from the video that I saw on YouTube. Excellent one. So link in the description to that one. So I basically looked at the C# code and replicated it into a node graph so I could get it to this point. And in the end, using, like, this is actually the formula to calculate the spring, and it's like a true formula for it. So that's kind of cool. So I set the force of the spring to a local variable here, L force, and then I add the suspension force. So I take my box, which is my physics object here in my blueprint. That's the target, and then the force, I'm taking the spring direction, multiplying it by the force, and then applying that one. And this is add force at location. Here's a beautiful thing, because you don't want to apply that in the center of the box. You want to apply it where the spring is, or where the wheel is. So the location is just the wheel position. So it's position of this scene component. A scene component is basically a transform in Unity or a game object. So now it's, if this is the right front wheel and I've calculated the force of the spring, then it's applying it at the location of that spring. So it applies the upward force there to compensate for the weight of the car. And this, again, it blew my mind that it worked pretty good. And I just have a toggle as well to say if I want to draw a debug to do this one. So it draws a debug line if I've got that one enabled. And it just takes the line start and the end and then puts a blue color with a little arrowhead. If I'm grounded, set the wheel mesh location to grounded. Let's see where. This is a bit confusing. If I've set the wheel mesh to airborne here, set wheel mesh location grounded. Okay, this is a bit confusing because it just says set wheel mesh location. It should just be no, because I've added this airborne one later on. So now it just sets the wheel mesh to the wheel mesh calculated location. And then it returns whether I was grounded, and it returns the force magnitude. And if I go back here, you can see that I'm doing this for the right front wheel. And then I just set the variable if it's grounded because I need that later on for skidding and stuff. And then I set the force because I also need that for whatever reason. Can't remember why I needed that. And then I do it for all 4 wheels. So one thing that I could do here to make it better in the future is I could do a for each loop and have an array of the wheels instead. I could create an array of 4 wheels and just apply the same logic to all of them. Because if you want to add more than 4 wheels, for example, you want to do like a tank or something, you could probably want to add more. I also did this one to try. I explained before about the auto steer. Like if a car is moving in one velocity and the steering wheel is in a different, the wheel, if you let it go, it'll auto correct it into that location. It's super cool, actually. I've used it a lot when I drift a little bit on my own and you're not supposed to do that on the roads and stuff, but sometimes you do, and it's fun. But when you just let go of the wheel, it corrects itself. And I tried to auto steer based on the velocity, but I colored this red in the end, and I didn't end up using it. So it's just here if I need it in the future to play around with it. So steering, let's see, I've got a little logic for steering here. I differentiate between steering and centering apparently, and then I rotate each steering wheel in the steering direction. And it's not the steering wheel, it's the steering wheels. And then it lerps those based on a speed too. So I'm not going to go through this one in detail, and but it's just a function at least for handling the steering of the wheels. And then I set the linear velocity variable. I don't know why I should probably move that into my grouped calculations before, because it doesn't need to be in its own one here, but I need the linear velocity for other things like calculating the sound and stuff. And then here is this is the one I did first, the tire, or the proper but less fun type of friction. So inside this wheel side friction force, similar to what I did before, but inside this one, here's the second part of that video. It's basically replicating that C# math to get the sideway friction force. So I'm using that logic to calculate just same mathematical formulas and looking at the cross product of vectors and calculating wheel slip and getting the force required to push the wheel back. And then it applies that force in the end after I've done that, and I can draw the debug arrow too. After I did this one, I was just not happy with the way this was behaving. So back to the drawing board, and that's where I just marked this red because I created this one instead, torque-based fake friction. So I calculate and add the turn torque based on the steering, and I look it up in a turn curve. And this turn curve here is basically, if I bring this one up. So if my velocity speed is 0, it's not going to allow me to apply any force. And then I just gradually allow it to do more torque. And I can tweak these curves now based on if it's not feel right, if it doesn't feel right, or if I want to do different for different cars, I can tweak this curve a little bit to simulate it the way I want to. And then I only do it if I'm grounded, because if I'm not grounded, then I shouldn't be able to steer it in the air. So, and then I add the torque here in degrees to my little box, physical box object. So after that one, I do calculate and add friction force based on sideways velocity grounded friction curve. Okay, what am I doing here? I can't even remember. But I'm doing something. Calculate and add friction force based on sideways velocity. So here's the torque. Okay, add force. Okay, so this is actually if the car is traveling in one velocity, sideways for example, a little bit 45-degree angle, but I'm facing forward, then I'm calculating a simulated force on the wheels to make me stop moving sideways and start moving like more in the direction where I'm rolling. And I control this a little bit, multiply by more force for some additional grip. So if I wanted to have a little power up for my car or a little modification, I could just have it ramp up this value here, the little one that I'm multiplying it with. So I could just gradually just add more grip to the car. And then I do calculate real wheel grip, average point, slip amount, and it's because I need to know if I'm going to do the skid marks and stuff. So I'm just taking an average point between the two rear wheels, and then I calculate the linear velocity at that point, and I compare it to the way the car is facing. So if I'm facing that way, but I'm traveling this way and the rear wheels are there, I can calculate the force so I can get the wheel slip amount for my rear wheels. Very important, because that's what I need to use to spawn my skid marks and to do the sound. So I've also had a little, it's not perfect yet, all of these curves. So to allow donuts, I had to actually do a little detection. If I'm accelerating quite hard, and my normalized speed is 0.3, then I have to basically reduce my angular drag. It's a dirty way of doing it. It's not perfect yet, so I'll probably figure out a better way to do it. So control angular velocity based on a normalized speed and lookup. So I've got another ramp here. This is my angular damping ramp. So if I'm going super slow, my damping is super high. It's like 100. So because if I'm going slow, I don't want the car to just like rotate in the middle of like somewhere by not doing anything. So basically it makes it so it's not gonna rotate if I'm standing still. And if I go a little bit faster, my damping will lower all the way down to here where I'm already at just a pretty low speed still here. Then I'm just applying like a 0.9, I think it is my damping, which is my default one, more or less. And if I'm not grounded, then I snap the angular damping to 0.05 here. And then I also had to do a braking force for the wheels, so I got all the wheels. Here I'm actually creating an array of all the wheels, and I do a for each loop, and then I make an array to say if they're grounded or not, and then I brake at the wheel, so I'm just calculating a brake force and then applying that to the wheels. And then I did a little brake wheel. I think I just copied my graph for acceleration, and I changed it to braking forces instead, and then that's my little pink arrows if I'm doing it. So not sure if I'm doing this correctly yet, but it does a good enough job to at least allow me to brake a little bit, and probably tweak that. And then acceleration, I'm doing for each of it's a rear wheel drive car. So this is from the Unity video that I found. So I copied that mathematics to calculate my acceleration force and apply it at the wheel location. Again, it's important to apply it at the location, not in the center of the rigid body or like the physics objects, but at the location of the wheels. So I calculate the force and then I do it, and then I draw just red arrows so I can see where it is. Red arrows, cool. Should display fighter jets, nice. And then I do rolling wheel approximation. So I've done all of that stuff. So now for each wheel, I just estimate how much the wheel has traveled forward. So I store it in a variable called, I think anyway, previous location or something. Yeah, previous location. So based on how far it's traveled and the size of the wheel, I just rotate the wheel. So simple as that. And if I make it sound simple or something, don't believe me, I'm not expecting, I have to say this again, because it sounds like I'm like saying that this is a walk in the park and like, oh yeah, and this is how you do this. This took me a long time, but systematically doing it started to make sense. And don't be worried if you're confused and stuff in the beginning. The important thing is to start small and then iterate over that one and build it up. And then gradually it'll start to make more and more sense. So at the end of it, you'll like get to the point after a long while, I guess. Like, how did it even get here? It's like stuff is there and it's working. So again, don't get discouraged if you have no clue what these things are doing. And maybe you can come back to this video in the future or something and like, oh yeah, I remember him saying something about a rolling wheel approximation. I'll look at that part of the video or something. But this is not a tutorial. I just want to stress that again. It's just literally showing you after all my my prototyping what I ended up with. All right, with that said, I add custom gravity because when you do arcadey type of games, then you want higher gravity than normal. Because if I apply normal gravity, it's super floaty and you'll basically jump on a jump and fly like super far, too far. So then I just double my gravity here. So I apply double gravity to my car and adds it into the force down. And then I do skid marks. So I calculate the alpha value based on my slip. And I do this for the 2 rear wheels only. And then I check this, the wheel slip amount. I take away 200 and then I divide it by 3000 for some reason. These are values that I've figured out by looking at the forces, what I don't even know what units the forces are in Unreal Engine. I've just figured out like roughly it's an order of magnitude or something, or 10 or 3 times the order of magnitude in differences. So I managed to calculate how to get it down into a normalized value, and then I create a color with an alpha value and I feed that into my parameter color of my my skid marks there. And then I do emit this rear tire marks. I do another sequence here for each wheel. And then here I actually learned how to do macros instead. I don't really know yet when it's better to use a macro than a function, but I thought I'd try it. So this one handles the skid marks, and it just enables or disables or activates and deactivates the Niagara system based on if it should emit particles or not. And then I do the same for the tire smoke. I do same thing for the 2 wheels, and I've created a similar one here. This one just activates a different Niagara system. All right, so that brings us, that's basically all the car physics. This stuff, I'll just mention what it is. This is for audio, so I calculate RPM, like a fake RPM value, which I'm not using. I mentioned before, the sound is very important, whether it's on load or off load, because if you're accelerating, it's under load. And if you're having the clutch in or decelerating or something, it's offload. So you need to have the distinction. So I needed to calculate that. And then I calculate the normalized skid so I can get that for the skid sound. And then I calculate and set rev limiter, 2 M's there for some reason, for my audio blueprint. And I set the skid for the audio blueprint and exhaust backfiring. I set these are little macros and stuff that I had to create to do those. So this is my whole blueprint for the car. The one thing that I had to create separate, if I look in my... Oh yeah, and here's the viewport of the car itself. Yes, it's just like a car mesh and 4 wheel meshes. And then I've got some brake lights. And I've got positions here for the skid marks, and these NS are Niagara systems for that. And then I've got 2 blueprints that I had to create, and one's for the car engine audio. And I can go into this one instead. So this is a child actor called car engine audio. And here I'm getting those variables that the rev limiter value that I calculated, and if it's on load and if it's on load or off load. And then it sets those parameters to this stuff. And this is a meta sound source. Super cool stuff in Unreal Engine. Instead of just having a sound source, there's something called a meta sound source. And if I go into one of these, can I double click on it? No, I cannot. So I'll go here and look at MSS. This is the one, I think. Is this version 2? I think so. So this looks like a blueprint, but it's not. This is actually the audio system, but it looks very much like a blueprint. And this is the past couple of days I started to learn these things. So it's I'm not really that good with it yet. I'll stop it first of all. The gist of it is that I do a wave player and I play the idle sound just as a loop. That's my bass sound. It's always playing there. But the output of this one, the mono output, I crossfade here with this section, because this is my accelerate sound. Why am I missing? Did I move on? Anyway, so my acceleration input, it can trigger, it detects if I'm accelerating, and then it picks a random value from my array here, my acceleration waves, and then it sets that one, and it sets a random start time a little bit, so it's not starting at the same location all the time. And then it plays this wave, and it outputs this to the mono here, and it cross mixes this one. So if I'm accelerating, it picks this sound instead and crossfades it and replaces my idle sound. And if it's nearly finished, I can detect that. It's built into this meta sound stuff, pretty cool. Then I play my top speed sound instead, and then I stop this sound. Why am I stopping? Oh yeah, so I'm actually making sure that the top speed sound is not playing when I come into my acceleration sound. But it's playing if the acceleration sound is finished. If it's reached all the top, they're pretty long, so they usually don't reach that part. But then it starts to play this one, outputs the mono, and then it mixes these two together, and then I have my acceleration sound. I don't know why I've messed something up here. I need to fix this. There. So maybe I'll just move that one in the past. Okay. And do something similar here for deceleration and brake to idle. So I do the same type of logic. I look if I'm braking instead, pick a random wave file from my deceleration waves, and that's actually got these little ramps going down. That's a bad simulation. And then it goes back to idle as well if it's if it reaches all the way to the bottom, and it crossfades to that one. And finally, if I'm hitting the rev limiter, then my rev limiter value will be above 0. And then if it does that, it crossfades into my rev limiter sound. And then in the end, it just outputs one mono sound for the car. And I do something similar for for the skid marks, I think. Let's see. If I go to my BPA skid, this one's a little bit simpler. It just sets a float parameter of skid. And for that meta sound, I've just got a wave player that plays a fixed skid sound. I loop it, and then the skid one will just crossfade it from nothing into the skid and back if it's back to 0. So that's how I do the skid sound. Alright, so there you have it. That sums up my little experiment of creating my own physics, vehicle physics in Unreal Engine and learning blueprints in the process. It's been a super fun journey, I have to say that, and I'm really happy with the momentum. First, I struggled a lot, and I've been trying to learn Unreal Engine for a couple of years now. And I come in it and I sort of get lost a little bit and I lose momentum, and then I have to do other stuff. But for this project, I actually managed to finally get to the point where it started to snowball. So I started to understand the blueprints and the workflow a little bit better, and my variables and the different game controllers and all sorts of play states and pawns and I don't know. It's just, it starts to click a little bit after so long now. So I'm happy about that. I had a similar experience when I learned Blender. First, I struggled a lot with Blender, and I had to start it 4 or 5, 6 times even before I finally got it to click and switch over to learn how to model in there. And I'm starting to get to that point. So if you're trying to learn Unreal Engine and you're struggling, don't worry about it. You're going to be struggling for a while, and it's difficult. It's especially if you're coming from a different game engine. I thought it'd be easier if you know a different game engine, but you're so set into your ways of Unity, for example. So it's difficult to adapt it and get used to these different ways of working. And as I get more comfortable, I'm really looking forward to have a video that's really dedicated to show, in the way I show things, I guess, how things are different and how you can adapt to those. Because it took me a long time. I had to search a lot and try to figure it out, and stuff that sort of I expected to make total sense didn't make any sense at all. But now that I'm starting to learn it, I think I want to be able to help other people to take that journey too. Where this project is heading next, I'm not so sure about. I'd like to get it to a point where I actually create a little drifting racing game to be able to release that at some point too, but I've got a lot of things going at the moment, so I don't know when that would be. But I'm going to treat it as my learning project and keep learning Unreal Engine. One thing that I just learned a lot is how to create sequences and render those to a separate file, and it's super powerful in how you can actually use something called a take recorder to record your actions. And then you basically play that sequence back and then record it into a video file, and it outputs the audio and stuff. And I struggled a lot to get Niagara to work with it and my sounds, and it was pretty a steep learning curve for that one. So that's another video that I could do on this topic, because it's super powerful. A lot of super stuff here, but it's good stuff. Alright, if you found some value out of this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And also a huge thank you to my patrons. Without you guys, I couldn't do it. So patreon.com/Imphenzia. A huge thumbs up to you guys as well, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.